Where's Teddy? That's a good question. He's in the bedroom. All right, so it's 3:10, so let's get started. Thanks for being here today. So I'm doing a presentation on scoring Jefferson Then and Now, which is the documentary series that I have created for the Jefferson Historical Society. Um, my name's Alex Berner. I'm a composer, so I write music. And just to give a little background on myself, I grew up in Richmondville, Seward area, and went to Cobleskill Richmondville High School. So I'm a local. And I grew up very interested in music, and I played clarinet and guitar growing up and really fell in love with music, of film scores and just uh, many types of music, but in particular composing for film and games. So um, I ended up following my dad's advice. My dad's Kevin Berner, the president of the Historical Society, and he was a college professor at SUNY Cobleskill. And he had always mentioned how um, the students that he saw were the most successful in his classes just really knew what they wanted to do and had a passion for it. So I ended up going to school in Boston at Berklee College of Music for video game scoring and film scoring. And during that time, formed a video game audio company with my friend and business partner Chase Harris. And I've been working on scoring and creating apps and video game audio and podcast music for the last few years. So how I got involved on this project was my my dad approached me and asked if I would be interested in writing a kind of a theme song for some videos that they were producing to try to capture some of Jefferson's history and recordings of people, old stories they had. And I thought that was a really good idea to start trying to get some of the historical society's work into video form. So it gave me a lot of ideas, and I actually ended up pitching a whole series of mini short documentaries about different topics in Jefferson's history. So the first one we did was about the restoration of Judd Hall and the history of it. Then we did one on the town green. Then the one that we're going to talk about today, which is on the Fuller District Schoolhouse, and then one on specifically the map that's inside the schoolhouse. So basically, I pitched the Historical Society that project, and they liked it. And there was a grant that was due in, I think it was like 12 days, that was very kind of applicable for what we were doing, what we wanted to do. So I had a really quick turnaround time on the first episode. So basically had maybe 4 or 5 days to write the music for it and 4 or 5 days to create the entire video. So as my dad and the other members of the Historical Society got to work writing the grant and filming and recording some narration for it, I started getting to work on the music. And the first thing I got started on was the theme song. And because having the theme is one of those important things that leads to a lot of it's kind of the core essence of the project. And the theme has a lot of responsibilities and functions. So here's a few that I came up with that I think are really important that it fulfill. It needs to capture the core essence of the project. It should have a memorable hook or melody, something that helps keep it in your mind. And it should help tie the series together and unify multiple episodes or different topics into one kind of concise, clear feeling or presentation. So the first thing I want to do is look at that theme and one of the things I'm going to be asking you to do during this presentation is listen for some motifs and musical ideas that I'll point out, and then kind of listen to how they evolve throughout some of the examples of the score I'm going to show you. And just to clarify, the plan for today is to do this presentation about the music at first, and then we'll watch the video, the Schoolhouse episode together, which is about 15 minutes, and then I will take questions and answer anything anybody puts in the chat. So hope that sounds good. So again, getting started on the theme. I'm going to switch screen here so you can see here's a lead sheet. So a lead sheet's basically the melody with the associated harmony. And I'll zoom in here. And so again, let's take a listen to this. I have created just a little piano version. And what I'd like you to do is write in the comments what it makes you think of or feel. And then after that, I'll go through some of what I was thinking and how I came up with this. So let's listen. All right, so that's the theme I came up with, and it was the first thing I wrote for the project. And so I want to analyze it kind of through those functions that I feel like a theme needs to fulfill. So going back, number one, it needs to capture the core essence of the project. And so what does that mean? It needs to bring us to Jefferson, New York. And one of the ways to do that is by using more traditional language of American folk music. So there's simple chords and melody. We see, D, G, A. These are pretty simple, non-complex chords that are used traditionally in American folk music. It's in D, which is a very common key for folk music to be in, primarily because of the instruments used. So you would generally have a guitar, banjo, fiddle, and those instruments lend themselves very well to the key of D, also the key of G, E, A, all the keys that have sharps in them in general. So I do think there's some subconscious, at least for me, some subconscious feeling if I were to write this in a key that's kind of far removed from those, like D flat, that would feel a little off. So that's the first part, is trying to get the right feeling. And it needs to enhance the storytelling that's going on in the videos. So music, I think, is probably the quickest way to bring out emotion in people. So what I was trying to evoke here was very much the feeling of home, right? Something that's grounded and warm. So the other thing it should do is have a memorable hook. And you establish a hook generally by repeating a small motif a few times until it gets memorable. So I'm going to pull up a session where I can play piano through here so I can demonstrate a few things. One of the ways to help something also kind of get in your ears is to have it to have it feel familiar. And one way to do that is by focusing on creating a lyrical phrase first. This is a technique that I use quite often. And then seeing what that phrase implies musically. So the first phrase I came up with, let's see if this piano is working. I think we're on a French horn right now, which is not the correct track. All right, so we've got it here. And the phrase I came up with was, when I'm home in Jefferson. And that was the first kind of phrase I thought of that I wanted to base the music on. So I took those first few words, when I'm home, and it's kind of got a when I'm home rhythm to it. So just when I'm home. And then how does Jefferson sound when you're saying it in a statement? Jefferson. And it kind of has a slight downward pitch to it, Jefferson. And if you're asking a question, it wouldn't, but it's in a statement. So Jefferson. So we've got the first whole little line just built from that right here. When I'm home in Jefferson. And then we kind of go on from there. And I've found that helps it to feel more natural in the way that we hear it. And then from then on, I just kind of create other fragments based on that. So if we look at this figure, the Jefferson part here, these three notes, it comes back in a bunch of the music. Here it is again, one more time, another one here. So it's this little 16th note phrase right here that's repeated and put into your head. And so is this little phrase here, because that comes back too in different places. And that just helps to keep everything kind of clear and unified, to build everything out of the smallest amount of material possible. So if you listen through as we go forward, these little motifs are going to be woven in and out of the whole soundtrack. So we have our theme. And now what? How do we take this from just a little theme song here to a score? So how do we make it 15 minutes long and follow the rise and fall of the different things that are happening, what's being talked about on screen, what the images are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. Since this is a series, I scored it similarly to how I would a TV show. So very often they'll have kind of a bank of music that they use, and depending on the episode, pull some of that in or take some of it out, cut it up and try to fit it to the picture, because you want to have as much reusability as possible. Partly because it saves some time, but also because using the same material will, like I said, help to unify the experience of watching the series. So for this, I had written quite a few tracks for the first two episodes, but I realized I needed a couple more motifs or themes for this one. There were some things that hadn't been discussed. This is very based around what kids were doing day to day. And it had a little bit more of a kind of linear story element. In the video, Bonnie talks about what it was like for a kid from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, and what it was like for them walking to school and how they would start their mornings. So I wanted to find a way to capture the kind of element of more whimsical childhood, and also, well, let's start there. So I'm going to pull up the music for that. So this is the children's motif I came up with. So I'm going to play this and try to remember this, and I'll play it twice because it's short, so you can get it in your head a little bit as we listen to more examples. And one more time. All right, so that's the children's motif I wrote. Just this simple, light motif. And so that represents the children. And there's one more theme, which is the journey motif. So this is another one I wrote to kind of resemble, to think about what it was like walking those multiple miles home or to school each day for people in the kind of adventurous conditions. So I'll play this. So keep that in mind as we go forward, that simple. And so again, this uses chords that kind of remind me of kind of an Americana adventurous style with that's D to C. So again, moving forward, keep that in mind. Okay, so let me just change what project I'm in. Okay, so now we have our themes. How do we go about constructing arrangements and pieces? So once I've come up with these themes, I go and I finish up the video editing process. So I'll go and cut everything to where it needs to be and get more or less a locked cut, which means hopefully not going to change timing, and export that and bring it into my audio workstation, which is where I work on music. So I'm going to show you what that is. And there's a lot of different software that lets you produce, work on, and compose music. And the one I use is called Logic Pro, but they all have more or less the same functionality. So let's move over here. And so I'll import, right here is what it looks like. And I'll import into here the video. And it will appear on the side so I can work on music and move around here in a way that makes sense musically and see what's going on in the video at the same time. So I've got the themes, I've got the video. How do we want it to sound? What's the arrangement going to be? What kind of orchestrations do we need? And I see this has been mentioned in the chat, which I'm glad, but I was going for a very Copeland-esque Americana kind of orchestral sound. So that's very influenced by American folk music and was it's used in some of my favorite film scores too. There's a very distinct sound to it. It was used in scores like Lincoln, and a few other different Civil War or early American stories, basically. So I'll have this, and then I'll start getting arrangements together, and usually going through and sketching out on keyboard. But how do we get from the keyboard to an orchestral recording? Do we go hire an orchestra to do that? I mean, that would be great if we had the budget, but we're on a grant budget, so spending $50,000 to record an orchestra is probably not in the cards. So this is where a lot of the new technology has opened the doors for people and projects with lower budgets to still be able to access and produce music that has orchestral instruments. So how that's done, I'm going to give you an example. What I have to end up doing is basically recording through the technological implements I have orchestral music. And I have a few tools for that I'm going to demonstrate. This is a breath controller, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this sends musical instrument data to my computer. So when I blow through this, you can see this thing here, which controls the instrument's dynamics and different parameters that are set up to make it sound realistic. So right now I'm on a French horn. So if I start playing, and how that's done is actually, at the start of it, a very tedious process. What you're hearing is actually a real orchestral French horn, but it's basically put together by the computer. So this is a process called sampling. And what sampling is basically in a recording studio, they'll bring orchestral musicians in, sometimes soloists like this, and sometimes sections. So let's say a French horn section. And what they do is they record every note they can individually in different dynamics and in different lengths and different articulations. So let's say we pull up a clarinet instead. If I play a C on the clarinet, it's actually a B flat for them, but that's not important. But they've recorded this at multiple dynamics that then this will allow me to transition between. So it sounds relatively seamless as it fades between them. So that's the basic process of sampling. And then there's a bunch of programs that translate what I'm doing with my keyboard and this breath controller into what would make sense on the orchestral instrument. And this is a very time-consuming process because getting something that's not fully real to sound real is difficult. Our ears are very good at picking up small kind of discrepancies from how we know things should sound. So it can be a lot of work to go through and get all the orchestra together sounding realistic, emotive, and basically unified as one sound. But that's the process. So I'll do this for every instrument of the orchestra, like I said, and for each of the tracks. And I'm going to show you kind of what we end up with. So I'm going to close this session and open another one, which is from the mixing phase. And what mixing is basically taking all of the recorded tracks together that I've created with the breath controller, with all these orchestral samples, and combining them into a unified sound that sounds aurally concise to put into a project. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to pull that up. And we're going to take a listen to this track as well. And again, for people who jumped in here after I got started, I'm doing a presentation on scoring Jefferson Then and Now, the series for the Jefferson Historical Society. And then we're going to watch the episode together, and then I'm going to take questions. So this track that I'm pulling up right now is one of the new ones I wrote for the schoolhouse. And this ends up being the credits song and the one that plays at the beginning of the episode. So I ended up using it twice. And you can see here's all the instruments. So there's flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, some more woodwinds. I recorded a tin whistle live because any real instruments you can record and add to what I was just describing. It's called a mock-up, an orchestral mock-up. Any live instruments you can add to that really helps lend to the realism. Then we have a French horn, the whole orchestral string section, piano, harp, xylophone, and some bells. So what we have here is all of the tracks combined, and this is where I got it kind of sounding good. I'm going to play this and alternate and show you. So keep listening for the themes that I played earlier. I'm going to play the children's motif one more time so you can hear what to listen for. So there's that one. Here's the journey motif. And then there's the main theme. And remember that when I'm home motif going on too. So we're going to take a listen to this track. This one's called Journey to the Schoolhouse. And I'd like you to post in the chat any kind of emotions that it brings up for you, any thoughts you have, because like I said earlier, it really is, the goal is to connect to the emotional side of what's happening in the video. And we'll see how that all combines later. So here we go. So that was the first track I wrote for this for this episode that was unique to it. So I'm going to go through and see what everybody said. So we heard from Joan, nostalgia. Yep, that's a big thing of what I was trying to capture. From Rose, vastness, open space. Feels like a journey. From Michael, the sea natural is like the sun breaking out over Schoharie Valley. I like that imagery. That's nice. So yeah, that's I'm glad that you thought that, because that was really what I was going for. I was trying to capture some of the nostalgia and feelings of reminiscing about a time long ago, back when the people were, when they were children, on a journey to school. So journey's good too. And that was what I was trying to capture with that one. I've got one more track to play. And this is a little bit different sounding, but it contains a lot of the same themes. And this one's just titled Fuller District Schoolhouse. So I'm going to, again, kind of jump between these when I hear the themes come up. And again, if you could post in here what you feel like this one feels like to you. All right, so that was the other track that I wanted to play. And you guys said simpler time, school bells ringing, excitement of old home days, the promised land, definitely, I see, chore setting in the valley, farm setting. Yeah, that's very much what I was going for. I was thinking about a lot of the kind of chores that the students had to do together. As you'll hear, Bonnie talks about how they would send one of the boys to fetch water, and it was kind of a together experience where different members of the children were pitching in different areas. So I like what you all said. So thanks for chiming in. Okay, so now I have these tracks written, and I've kind of fit them into the episode in different places. And there's one last step that is the mastering. And mastering is kind of the last stage of the audio journey, which is where I go and balance the vocals, so the speech and the narration in the video with the music, and try to get that balanced and to have both as audible as possible. This is always can be tough depending on where we were recording. So for example, inside the schoolhouse, there's certain resonances within it that change the sound of people's voice and kind of amplify certain parts of their range, which can sometimes come in conflict with the music and make it so you can't hear the music, or you can't hear, or the music makes it so you can't hear what they're saying. So this is the part where you try to kind of even that out and make it sounding as good as possible. So I don't have anything else to say about the process. So let me just check in back, make sure I didn't miss anything. And so let's take a view together of the episode. And again, this is about 15 minutes. And afterwards, I'm going to take Q&A. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll talk to you when this is finished. Again, thanks for being here. It looks like the video wasn't there for that, so I'm just going to play it through YouTube from the link that you can check out on the Jefferson Historical Society's YouTube channel, which I'd recommend you go ahead and do. So let me just pull that up. For some reason, this export didn't have visuals for the intro, so let's fix that. Just make sure there's no other issues. And give me one more minute. All right, enjoy.
Welcome to our little red schoolhouse. Try to imagine going to school in one room with 8 grades and only one teacher. That's exactly how it would have been for the young scholars who attended school here when it was built in 1837. The school was placed in a rural area just off a road near a woods, exactly like this. But it was such a remote location, the school commissioners had to move the school. Before we go inside though, please take a note of the necessary next door. In 1837 there would have been 2, one for boys and one for girls. All right, let's go inside. Okay, first let's try and put what we're seeing into a little bit of perspective with some history of education in the United States and in New York State, and especially in Schoharie County. As early as 1795, it had become obvious that general education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, was essential for all of the population. Interest in education increased by the early 19th century, and as a result, the first public secular school in the country was founded by New York City Mayor DeWitt Clinton and others in 1805. Similar initiatives spread to other cities and then to smaller centralized areas like Jefferson and neighboring Stamford. Towns in Schoharie County began to support academies for large numbers of local students and offer more advanced courses. The first academy in Schoharie County was built in 1811 to 1812 here in Jefferson. You may have seen the historic marker on Main Street next to the village green where the Methodist Church stands now. In 1812, New York adopted laws for dividing and organizing each town into school districts, building schoolhouses and hiring teachers. The Jefferson Academy closed its doors in 1854, but by that time there were one-room schoolhouses throughout the county. In 1866, the town of Jefferson had 13 school districts with a total of 574 students. That works out to about 44 students per school. This one-room schoolhouse, which was built in 1837, continued in operation for almost 100 years until 1935, when it was finally closed. New York State began centralizing school districts then, and students were transferred to Jefferson Central School. The new Central School was located next to the village green where the old Jefferson Academy had been, and where the Methodist Church stands now. We understand that early on, most teachers were men. Teaching didn't pay a great deal, however, and as time went by, women began to teach as well. School boards tended to hire the women to teach in the spring, summer, and fall, when the older boys were busy on the farm. They tried to hire men to teach in the winter because they felt a male teacher could handle the older boys better than women. Attendance was very irregular, depending on planting and harvesting seasons as well as the weather. We've been told that on a good day, this school had about 25 to 30 students. Some pupils, they were called scholars in those early days, attended nearly all year, while others, especially the older boys, attended only when farm work was done. Students were often out sick as well, since there was little knowledge of sanitary practices. So diseases like smallpox, polio, measles and mumps, and diphtheria kept many children at home. Effective medicines, such as antibiotics, hadn't been discovered yet. Then there were young scholars who didn't care much for school. A gentleman named Bouck White wrote in 1910 about his early days in the Catskill Mountains. Here's what he said: "I didn't get much schooling, somehow never took to it. In fact, there wasn't much book learning to take to in those days. When you've got to walk 3 miles for it, the amount of book learning you're going to bring back with you isn't going to be very hefty. And when a boy brings home a good string of fish for the table, his ma isn't going to scold him much for going to play hooky from school." Students who attended one-room schools in this area in the 1930s have told us that their morning would start with the older students putting the flag out on a pole. Then they would all say the Lord's Prayer and end by singing America. Some schools, like this one, had a front hallway where students could hang their coats and leave their boots and umbrellas, and where they could store wood for the stove during the wintertime. Notice there are 2 doors, one for the boys' side of the room and one for the girls' side of the room. In the morning, one of the boys would usually go to the nearby farmhouse or well and get water for the students during the day. One of the girls who went to school at Shoe Hollow told it this way: "The older boys took turns coming over to our house every morning to get the ceramic jug filled with water. Each pupil had a cup brought from home which hung on hooks near the water jug." Blackboards were at first made of planed wooden boards painted black, but later some were surfaced with slate. The teacher would hand out assignments to students to be done at their desks. Notice that our desks are stationary wooden ones with attached wooden seats. One former student, Betty Mata-Lavage, who attended the one-room schoolhouse nearby in Shoe Hollow, said, "You had to be very careful doing your paperwork, as the desks all had carved mementos from past students, and your pointed pencil could puncture the paper you were writing on." Desks in the center aisle could hold as many as 3 students, and the ones in the side aisles held 1 or 2. Desks were smaller towards the front of the room. As students grew older, they were moved to the larger desks and chairs towards the back of the room. Betty said, "My feet never touched the floor in all the time I was in the various grades." She added, "One grade at a time would go up front for a reading lesson. When it was time to recite, you went up to the front seats where it was nice and warm. The whole front wall was blackboards, and a lot of our work was done up there. For example, writing and arithmetic. The school had a small library of shelves under the chimney. We read those books over and over. We also had a big leather case that contained maps of the world, the continents, the United States, and New York State. Another big leather case contained stamps of the alphabet and small pictures, which the teacher used to make up worksheets for us. In the winter, the schoolhouse was heated by wood supplied by local farmers. One of the older boys would usually come early to start the fire, but the students would have to wear their coats until the schoolhouse warmed up. The teacher sometimes made hot chocolate on the stove for the children during the winter. Students would warm their lunches on the stove and even cook potatoes in the embers for lunch. A former student in Gilboa, here in Schoharie County, described attending their one-room schoolhouse this way. "We had a wood stove we burned wood in, and it was cold. The windows would rattle, and sometimes our lunch would freeze, and we'd warm it up on the stove." There was no artificial light, except on special occasions when kerosene lamps were lit. After the advent of rural electrification in 1936, a few may have had electric light. This school closed in 1935, so it didn't have electricity while it was in use as a schoolhouse. When Fuller District No. 4 was closed in 1935 as a result of school centralization, all of the supplies and materials, including books and bookshelves, were sold at auction. The building then sat neglected for almost 50 years and became in need of repair. Barbara Palmer will tell you what happened next.
The schoolhouse was closed in 1935, and it sat empty, basically unused, but I think someone used it to store hay for a while. Cleo was a school bus driver, and so he drove past that school, which he had attended for 8 years, and he drove by it and kept saying to himself that he'd like to save it, do something with it. In the 1950s, the people that owned it said they'd give it to him as long as they moved it, and he restored it, which he was happy to do. To move it was quite a feat. It was actually in pretty bad shape by then. They took 4 tractors and logs. They jacked it up and got it on logs, and they took the tractors and moved it down the road. It was like not too far, probably a mile and a half, something like that. Then he had to go on to the restoration project, which was big. It took a few years, but not that long. But he replaced a lot of the clapboard on the side. He repainted the inside. People over the years, starting right off the bat, started donating all sorts of things. Tried to get things that were accurate to the time, and lots of books. Then they opened it to the public. They built outhouses, little picket fence, planted rugosa rose, did all the little things to make it nice. And they always had visitors. They had picnics, reunions, classes visited. It was a labor of love, definitely, for Cleo. And he and his first wife, Avis, began the restoration. Then Avis died, and he remarried my mom, whose husband had also died, and it was a passion for her also to By then it was restored, but they were still collecting things and still inviting people over, and really loved it. The 4th grade teacher would bring her kids over for one day because the 4th grade curriculum was New York State history. And she taught the kids a lot about the schoolhouse. They had picnic tables outside, and they go out and play games, and the kids loved it. The town moved it because it was donated to the town. That's what Cleo's wish had been. There was a big truck, and they loaded it on there, and had checked out all the wires along the way and all that stuff. And so they loaded it on the big flatbed and brought it up here and deposited it. He was a people person. He was a farmer. He was a Boy Scout leader, school bus driver, Grange member, always involved with something, helping out. And he was really community oriented. Everything kind of just went together as to save an old building and save the history. For one thing, I'm just thrilled that people have become so interested in it, because for a while it was here, but not really cared for. And Bonnie and Clara have just done this remarkable job of pulling some things together to make it even nicer and more historically accurate. And then, with the grant that we received from the Soil and Water people, we've got this really beautiful nature trail that goes by another historic site. So I think it's great for the community to have another beautiful thing to enjoy and to walk through and learn about.
All right. Well, thanks for watching the whole video, and I'll set it back to just me for now. So yeah, let's do some questions. So I'm gonna start at the top and work my way down. So if you have any thing you'd like to ask, go ahead and put it in the comment section, and I'll get to it. Again, where is Teddy? That's a good question. He's in the bedroom. Let's see. Yeah, just a comment on one thing that Michael Murphy said earlier. Yeah, the C natural. There's a moment in one of the themes where there's a C natural in the key of D major, and that he has said it sounds like the sun's shining over Schoharie County. And I think that that's one of the kind of characteristics of some American folk, is using that C natural chord, so a C chord in the key of D. From Nancy Niles, what factors influence using woodwinds or strings or brass? So that all kind of is determined based on the timbre or kind of emotional expression I want something to have. So in the big climax there of the piece at the end, it's very string focused with some solo woodwinds, and there's strings have a very dynamic kind of unified sound with all the string sections. If you think about the woodwind section, bassoons, clarinets, oboes, and flutes all have very different tone. They're very easily distinguished from one another. So if they're playing together, you're not going to feel this just kind of unified, blended sound of woodwinds. It's going to be, you'll still be able to hear the individual instruments. Whereas string sections, the basses all the way up to the violins very easily blend together. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. And in that climax, I wanted this full, warm sound. So that's why I went with a string bass with a tin whistle solo at the top with the first violins, kind of helping to make the melody more clear throughout the thick texture. Let's see. Thanks for all your kind comments. I'm glad it's making you feel of home, Michael. And thank you, Rose. I'm glad that you feel it ties the whole thing together. Another one from Nancy. When you were taking the videos in Jefferson, was there music forming in your head? Not really. I was trying to maybe soak up kind of the feeling of, in particular, being just outside. It was a nice fall day when I was filming, so it very much. I guess, probably subconsciously it did. There is probably kind of, I know, openness, a feeling of openness had been mentioned, which is probably something I subconsciously wanted to capture. I live in the city now, in Jersey City, like basically New York City. So when I go to back home to upstate, it definitely has a feeling of openness that I don't get quite as much down here, or at all. How long did it take to put this all together? I could add up my hours, but the soundtrack for this ended up taking longer than the video editing. I would say it took about probably a week, like a full week to do the music. And like I said, a big part of that is just all that orchestral mock-ups, like getting all of that to sound realistic. I'll give an example too. I'll pull up that session again. But give me one sec. But yeah, that's just a real time sink, because it could always be better. And it's hard to kind of know when to call it good enough. Let's see. Thanks, Joan. Thanks for watching. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Another one from Rose. How do you blend the multiple instruments and the genres are playing simultaneously? Yeah, so that's actually the session I have pulled up here. Let's look over at this again. The mixing. This is kind of, I guess you could almost think of it as the blending part. There's a few different levels of blending. The first one comes from just the arrangement overall, making sure that the melody's in a register that's clear and that the different elements can have definition and can all be audible. So, for example, to demonstrate that, let's look at the string section in the climax of that track that we were listening to earlier. Give it one sec. So we're just isolating the string parts now here. So having the melody on top here, the first violins, and then it separates, and let's just take a listen to the cellos. And then all the low strings, and the violas. So that's all going on underneath and helping to fill out the harmonies. And you can see here, this is basically, you see all these yellow lines. This is all little volume edits I've done in each of the parts. So if we look, there's quite a bit of that throughout, making sure everything's blended. And we could, take a listen just to the woodwinds. Let's see, maybe here. So just a quick story is I couldn't quite get that tin whistle in tune, so I used a modern production technique of auto-tune to make sure that it was in tune on some of the notes, because I was on take like 20 and kept playing some of the notes flat, so I just fixed that in the audio file. Did my walks with Teddy in the woods help create the musical choreography? Maybe. Although Teddy hasn't been to Jefferson, so maybe subconsciously. Do I feel the whole piece in my head and then tweak it, or do I do it piece by piece? I generally have a pretty rough little recording of everything that to everybody but me would probably sound super messy and kind of confusing. But so once it gets to that point, I can pretty much hear what it's supposed to sound like at the end. And then it's just kind of matching what it currently sounds like to where I know it needs to be at the end in my head. So the harmonies, it feels like harmonies. How did you make all this so seamless? So harmony is probably my favorite aspect of music. And it's interesting because music theory is the primary thing that really helps to understand the relationships between chords and what you can do with that. So there's lots of really interesting ways to move around through harmony that theory is super helpful. So it's really based on a lot of kind of what's the right word? Kind of historical, everything that we've ever heard in our life kind of builds into our musical intuitions. And that guides us for what we feel like sounds correct in certain resolutions. So in Western music, the kind of 5-chord, 1-chord, resolution is what sounds very satisfying, and there's a lot of different relationships in harmony that you can utilize once you kind of know how they sound and how to understand them. You can utilize to capture certain emotions. Have you thought about putting words to the theme? Yeah, I have. I want to make it a full song at some point, but I haven't dedicated the time to finishing it up. So I can tell which sounds go together and not. Sometimes a lot of it's trial and error. A lot of it is just seeing what sounds good. I'll play a melody on the oboe and realize, nope, that should be a horn melody, or I'll orchestrate a certain voicing of a chord, which means the which notes are in which instruments and in which registers. I'll try a few different ways and then maybe realize, oh, the clarinet should be on top, or some other different thing. Oh, the third isn't as prominent enough. I should add the French horn on that or something. So that's the basic overview. It's kind of intuition and then trial and error. And some things I can just instantly tell aren't right. Do I see a visual in my head when I compose, like colors or a scene? Definitely a scene. I'll often kind of lay out even markers in my session, which I'll just show here. Like, let's say right here, I wanted to do, I should know the key command, create marker, and then just write, let's say child wakes up, and then now they are brushing teeth, and I'll try to hit these sync points as if it was a scene in a film. So that can really help to give a structure and to tell me how long I need to get, and it creates some constrained creativity. Again, I might have actual guidelines for that based on what's happening in the film, but if I'm just writing the music separately, I'll try to do that. And are you playing the instruments or are you using the computer? I'd say that in this soundtrack, the only instrument that I actually played was the tin whistle, and I just recorded that right here and blended it as best I could. And part of the blending process is trying to make them all sound like they're in the same room. So I'm recording here in a apartment with bad acoustics, and all the samples were recorded in some of the best sounding rooms in the world. So trying to find a way to make a tin whistle recorded right here in front of this computer sound like it's being played in the same room with these instruments is part of the goal. Do I dream the music sometimes? No, I've honestly never dreamed music. I don't think it's usually first thing in the morning. I think of stuff the most quickly, though. And do I use my own personal experience or something I've read or a movie you have seen for inspiration, I'm guessing? Yeah, for sure. I try to, very often when I write, I try to just come up with some, like I said, a story here that I'm imagining a character going through, or pull up art or images that evoke kind of what I'm going for. So if I'm if I'm trying to write like about a journey to school, I might pull up a little picture I took of an open field in Jefferson, and then I'll just kind of keep that in mind and imagine what it's like to be there. Yeah, and I see with coffee, coffee is definitely the best performance enhancing drug for composing. In fact, Beethoven had some pretty crazy coffee ritual where he measured, as apparently, I think you should fact check this, but apparently he had counted down to the bean how many beans he had in his coffee every morning, and I tend to think that it's historically very significant. Am I better at night? No, I'm actually, my best composing is within probably 40 minutes of when I get out of bed. I'm not really the kind of, sometimes I'll work late into the night if I'm on a roll, but I'm not one of the artists that kind of functions best at night. At night, I just want to relax and go to sleep, or it's just not work. Starbucks or Dunkin', neither. I make my own cold brew, but I like both. Okay, any other questions? Again, thanks do I get in the zone? Yeah, I think that's the most important part is creating mental space to really focus on one task, because writing music is definitely a cognitively difficult task because you have to keep in mind so many different elements. You're engaging in the act of creating something, which is you really have to keep in mind what you're trying to create Keep in mind how it's making you feel. Keep in mind the tools you have in place, the tools you have available to be able to, that you can utilize, and also continuously thinking how to make it better or how to do something differently to make something unique or interesting. And so it takes a lot of focus, and honestly, it's 90% of my day is just staring at the computer, like the screen, and editing things and looking at different windows. So this is what is burned into my eyes at this point, this window right here. Yeah, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the comment, and thanks, Rose, and everyone else that's been here, Joan and Nancy and Kevin. So again, thanks for joining me. Feel free to reach out to either the Historical Society. I'd recommend you follow them on Facebook if you don't already, and on YouTube. I'm going to post a link to the YouTube right now, actually, in the chat, so that you can check that out, because all the episodes of the channel, or of the series, are on there. So let me just get the link so it's for easy access. All right, there you go. And if you'd like to follow me on any social media, you can do that. I'll link to my Facebook here. I'll put a comment when this is done in here. And so my name's Alex Berner, and again, I'm Kevin's son with the Historical Society. And thank you to the Historical Society for the opportunity of doing this and making this series, and really getting the opportunity to dive deep and create something in a format that I think is really important to do going forward. Everybody's attention spans are a bit lower nowadays, and I think it's important to present historical information in the places that people spend their time. And the Historical Society has been really good at doing this by really using Facebook very effectively to help engage people in discourse and to help bring knowledge about the community. So I think YouTube and videos and content in video form is a really important thing for doing that as well. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.